Good morning. I want to turn to Psalm 34. In 2009, we had the death of a close family member, and I purposed to read this psalm every day for the next year because it encouraged me and it spoke to me and it was very meaningful to me. I read a lot of other things at the time, but I always came back and read this every day for a year. So I thought I wanted to share a little bit about it, but if you turn to Psalm 34, and it starts out a psalm of David when he feigned madness before Abimelech, that's kind of a title like Pharaoh, whose actual name was Achish. He was a Philistine guy from Gath, who drove him away and he departed. So this was the setting for this. There's several psalms, I think there's 8 or maybe 10 of them that David wrote that are specific to times in his life. And it's interesting because, think back at his time, how did they write a psalm? The instruments they had to even write something down. And David is kind of mobile at times and here and there. So I got to believe that he came back and wrote a lot of these maybe later when he sat down. So I can appreciate that he took the time to reflect on what God was doing in his life and wrote these. Psalm actually means to pluck. So these were specifically organized to sing, and David was a guy that would be capable of plucking, right? So we're in Psalm 34, but I want to give a kind of a brief history of how he got to this psalm. Okay, so if you want to turn back with me to 1 Samuel 16, we're just going to kind of scoot through some material here. We're going to read some sections and just kind of flip through. So if you have little headings in there, we might just go over those and catch us up. So if you turn to Psalm 16, I'm sorry. Yeah, that'd be 1 Samuel 16. Don't mind me. 1 Samuel 16, it says, Now the Lord said to Samuel, How long will you grieve over Saul, since I rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have selected a king for myself among his sons. You know, Samuel's an interesting guy just from his upbringing under Hannah and all that stuff, and Eli. And it's what an adventure he lived. And he's kind of, terror fills people sort of when he comes around because he's representative of God to them, kind of at the time. So, verse 2, I will skip down to verse 4. So Samuel did what the Lord said, and he came to Bethlehem. This is 1 Samuel 16, verse 4. So that Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem, and the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, Do you come in peace? So he carries a big hammer potentially, okay? Verse 5, he said, In peace I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. Verse 6, when they entered, he looked at Eliab, which is be like the first son of Jesse. Surely the Lord's anointed is before me. Verse 7, but the Lord said to Samuel, Do not look on his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I've rejected him. For God sees not as man sees, for a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Verse 11, skip over to verse 11. None of those Samuel felt like were the ones that he's coming here to anoint a king. He hasn't told anybody else that he's coming there to anoint a king. Why? Because they have a king. And he could be scared to start a civil war if they know that they have King Saul, and we have now Samuel on the scene that's going to anoint another king. Verse 11, and Samuel said to Jesse, Are these all the children? That's interesting that, so David is the last son of Jesse, and he wasn't invited, which I don't believe that they couldn't have exempted him from watching the sheep for a little while for this big event. So either he's can't be exempted because he's too important to watch the sheep, or Jesse thought he was too insignificant, or it all happened so fast they didn't have a time to call him in or whatever. So for some reason, David was not invited along with his brothers. In verse 11, Samuel said to Jesse, "Are these all your children?" He said, "There remains yet the youngest, and behold, he's tending the sheep." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down until he comes here." You know, the patience the people had in prior times is just phenomenal, isn't it? Verse 12. So he sent and brought him. Now he was ruddy. This is a description of David. He's ruddy, kind of red. So what would that mean to you if they called him ruddy red? Redhead? Maybe he'd been out in the sun a lot. He lived that life. So he's got beautiful eyes and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David. Remember the guy that wasn't invited initially, now the Spirit of the Lord has come on. From that day forward, and Samuel arose and went to Ramah. He left. He just left. Samuel just left. No explanation given, right? Samuel did what God sent him to do clearly. He picked through, got the 8th son, waited around for him to get there, pours the oil on him, the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and Samuel leaves. Verse 14, now the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, an evil spirit from the Lord terrorized him. Verse 15, Saul's servants then said to him, "Behold, now an evil spirit from God is terrorizing you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you. Let them seek a man who is a skillful player on the harp, and it shall come about that when the evil spirit from God is on you, that he shall play the harp with his hand, and you will be well." Verse 17, so Saul said to his servants, great idea, "Provide for me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me." Then one of the young men said, "Behold, I've seen the son of Jesse, who is a skillful musician, a man of valor, a warrior, one prudent in speech." Imagine that. That's the testimony of a guy who is clearly a young man, that he was prudent in speech. And enough that's noted to King Saul, right? Not only does he have musical ability, not only is he a warrior type guy, he actually, prudent is giving thought to your ways. He actually has some control over the things that come out of his mouth. And he's a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. So how does this guy know that the Lord is with him? Verse 19, so Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me your son David, who is with the flock." Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread and a jug of wine, a young goat, and they sent him. You always got to send something with him when you go see the king. Verse 21, then David came to Saul and attended him. Saul loved him greatly. Underscore, Saul loved him greatly. And he became his armor bearer. Probably slash, harpist, etc. He becomes a slash, because look, the guy's got all kinds of abilities. We just thought he was a shepherd. Here's a guy that had cultivated, either by the direction of God, by the direction of his parents, or whatever. This guy had developed himself to be extremely useful in God's kingdom, though he wasn't invited when Samuel came around, though he is noted by the commoners as a guy who the Lord was with. Verse 22, Saul sent, this is 1 Samuel 16:22, Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David now stand before me, for he's found favor in my sight." The king loves him, and he's found favor with the king. So it came about, whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, note one thing that Saul does not do. He does not inquire of the Lord or do anything extracurricular to try to figure out why this is happening. We'd like to think that if we have an evil spirit coming upon he's having this happen, that he might seek out why, rather than try to push it aside by great music. So it came about, whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would be refreshed and be well, and the evil spirit would depart from him. So here's some things that are going on. I'm going through the early life, like the first little portion of David's life, because he becomes, we already established that he's uninvited shepherd, right? Who is loaded with talent. Probably not appreciated in his own family, and some of you may or may not be able to identify the fact that your family may or may not have been your greatest cheerleader. Fortunately, that's why God made moms, right? So that we could all have cheerleaders. So he's the shepherd. He's the youngest of Jesse. He's not present. This is some of his events. He's anointed the king of Israel while Saul is still king. He's Saul's personal harpist. And if we flip to 1 Samuel 17, we're not going to read all that, but my heading says it's Goliath's challenge, and I think we're all familiar with the story of David and Goliath. And verse 19, David accepts the challenge that this uncircumcised Philistine sits and rants against the armies of God. David thought it was astonishing. Now remember, the Spirit of the Lord was on him, so he was in tune with God, and he understood that with his rantings and ravings from this giant were detestable to God. And David's going to represent God correctly. So we go down to 17:25. It says, the men of Israel said to David, who is, have you seen this man who's coming? Surely he's coming up to defy Israel. And it'll be that the king actually has thrown out this thing. He's going to enrich the man who kills him. You get money, great riches, verse 25, and will give him his daughter. How's that? You get married that day. And his father's house free, tax-free. So you're tax-free, married, and money. That's how much it was worth to Saul, the supreme guy of Israel, to get rid of this Goliath guy. Latter part of verse 26, David says, for who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? Now, verse 28, we have Eliab, his oldest brother. I didn't really sit there and try to calculate how much older or what difference there would be, but he'd have to be approximately 18 or so years older than him. And the last part of verse 28, this is what Eliab says, I know your insolence and the wickedness of your heart, for you have come down in order to see the battle. Seems like the older brother, right? Putting him in his place. But not, Eliab, disappointing. Not really in tune with who David really is. Do you realize that this guy who you just said was insolent and had wickedness in his heart is the guy that plays for Saul? He's the king's armor bearer. And you were there. What did Samuel do with that oil stuff on top of David? So sometimes there are people we know that are speaking into our life who are not in tune with what God is doing, right? So if I scan on down, the heading above verse 31 said David kills Goliath. Verse 32, David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go off and fight with this Philistine. And he says in verse 33, but you're but a youth. And he goes on, verse 36, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. Verse 37, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of his Philistine. I thought it was great in prayer today, Ellen, you were mentioning about the testimonies of the things that God has done in our life and kind of the reminders that we have. I was kind of encouraged in hearing that because David has these things that God allowed to happen in his life that are not just a show of strength. They were deliverances. He sees them as God working through him, sufficient that he feels confident going against the Philistine, but clearly he is not confident in his own strength. But really, I think he's looking back at the testimonies of what God's done through his life. So this is what Saul says to him, go, may the Lord be with you. God bless you, brother. Go on out and take him on. Verse 45, then David said to the Philistine, you come with me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. Verse 47, and all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he'll give you into our hands. Now, this is a guy that was the guy with prudent speech, right? Clearly, this guy knows, I thought he gave thought to his ways and the things he said. He had learned great lessons early in his life. Flip on to chapter 18. You know, later Saul somehow, I don't know the chronology of this, the way the original compilers of the Bible put it together, but Saul comes back in verse 58 and says, by the way, who was that guy that did that thing to Goliath out there? And he comes forward, they bring him, round him up, and he says, I am the son of your servant Jesse the Beth. He did not come and say, I am David the Great. He came and said, I am your servant, the son of Jesse. Psalm 18, or excuse me, 1 Samuel 18. Verse 1, now after this event with Goliath, it says, it came about, we finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David. So there's some connection there. This is all in the part of David's movement, his growth, the highs and the lows of his life. Verse 2, Saul took him that day and did not let him return to his father's house. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself, etc. So Saul is now keeping him at his house. Who gave us a little reminder that someday a king might just take your sons and make him into all the things he wanted him to be? Samuel, yeah. When they said, God told him, Samuel, when Samuel thought, these people are crazy, they're wanting a king, God said, let them have a king. They haven't rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me. And by the way, when you go talk to him, tell him all the stuff a king's going to do. He's going to take in and script your kids to be in his army so he can march around, do all this stuff. He's going to have people do this, people do that. And there we are, living it out. David gets sucked up into the king's personal armor bearer, and then he's going to be all these other things. So he's now made a covenant with Jonathan. We'll drop down to verse 6. It happened as they were coming when David returned from killing the Philistine that the women came out of the cities. Actually, go back to verse 5. David went out wherever Saul sent him and prospered, and Saul set him over the men of war, and it was pleasing in the sight of the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. So now everybody agrees that David has now got a military higher ranking. The women came out in verse 6, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy and musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his 1,000 and David his 10,000. So David is now in popular music by the women. It says they came out from all Israel. This is his progression. He was the guy that wasn't invited. But all of a sudden, he's like a household name. He's sung about in songs. Verse 13. We're in chapter 18. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence and appointed him as commander of 1,000, which is exactly what Samuel told them would happen. Verse 16, but all Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came before them. So now he's gaining in popularity with everybody. Not only does Saul love him, Jonathan loves him, they all love him. And the women sing about him. So Saul must have thought about, well, I did make this commitment to this guy that I would give him money, and I would give him a daughter, and I'd give him tax exemption for his family, and he has a pile of brothers, so that's quite a tax exemption. Verse 17, so here is my older daughter Merab, so then he gets this wife, but then later down in verse 19, at the last minute, they give her away to another guy. And then verse 20, chapter 18, now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David, and they made it agreeable. So he goes on, and verse 20, he has to go kill off some Philistines for that. Verse 27, David rose up, he and his men, and struck down 200 men among the Philistines. And they gave, so Saul gave him Michal as his daughter for wife. That's the last part of 27. And verse 28 says, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So he's got a wife that loves him now. He's well-known, popular, military guy. Verse 30, then the commanders of the Philistines went out to battle, and it happened as often as they went out that David behaved himself more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so his name was highly esteemed. Chapter 19. So in 18, we have Jonathan and David become friends. David becomes a household name. He's sung about. He has military success. He's a commander of 1,000 men. He's loved by all Israel. He's Saul's son-in-law. He's most successful in military value. When we're in verse 19, verse 1. Now Saul told Jonathan, his son, and all his servants to put David to death. So David was riding a pretty good high there, right? Pretty popular, pretty successful. And now he has a death warrant. Flip to chapter 20. So we have David and Jonathan make this covenant. Turn to verses 41 and 42 of 1 Samuel 20. When it was determined that David was never going to be able to go back and eat at the king's table, that was over because everybody there wants to kill him. David rose from the south, verse 41, David rose from the south side and fell on his face to the ground and bowed 3 times. They kissed each other and wept aloud, but David wept the more. Jonathan said to David, "Go in safety, inasmuch as we have sworn to each other in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord will be between me and you and between my descendants and your descendants forever." Then he rose and departed, while Jonathan went into the city. Notice there is no vindictiveness at all between Jonathan and David, though think about what could happen. If David became king, what might they do with Jonathan? He could be executed. What might Jonathan do to David to get him out of the way? Yeah, so they could be mutual assassins of each other. Instead, they depart as deep friends. 1 Samuel 21. Then David came to Nob to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech came trembling to meet David and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one's with you? We know you're a commander of 1,000. We know you do all this stuff. He probably seldom travels alone. Why are you coming here now? You being who you are, I know there's a death warrant for you, and why are you coming here by yourself?" Verse 6, so he asks for something to eat, etc. He kind of tells him a little story, which I don't think is true, but he just helps make him feel at ease. Verse 6, we're not here to analyze that part of it. Verse 6, so the priest gave him consecrated bread, and there was no bread but the bread of the presence, which was removed before the Lord in order to put hot bread in its place. So he gives him I think it's the retiring consecrated bread, which Jesus comes back later and mentions it. Note that in verse 7, this guy named Doeg the Edomite, one of Saul's chief shepherds, was detained before the Lord. So it was really Ahimelech, David, and Doeg. Why David chose to have this conversation with Ahimelech, or Ahimelech chose to converse with David in the presence of this guy, is interesting. So verse 8, David said to Ahimelech, "Now is not there a spear or a sword on hand, for I brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's urgent was matter." The priest said, "The sword of Goliath, the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, behold, it's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you would take it for yourself, take it. For there is none other." The only weapon I've got is like we stashed Goliath's sword here. And David said, "There is none like it. Give it to me." Now imagine at this point in David's life, that had to be a bit encouraging, right? Like if he had ever failed to think about this Goliath thing, probably like every day, once you got the sword back in your hands, wow. So we'll talk about that more when we get back to the conclusions. Verse 10, so David arose and fled that day from Saul and went to Achish, king of Gath. But the servants of Achish said to him, so Gath is like a Philistine place. So interesting, David would flee to the Philistine spot, and as if he would be like incognito or somehow be unrecognizable. And the first thing they said is, "This is David, isn't he? They call him the king of the land." Glad Saul didn't hear that, right? Not only was he this warrior and all this stuff, they actually think he's the king. And they said, "Did not they sing of him as they danced, saying, Saul has slain his 1,000? And David said, the song with his name in it is like a hit. All the way to the Philistines know it." Verse 12, and it was interesting, Peter talking about Jesus saying, "Fear not." In verse 12, 1 Samuel 21, David took these words to heart and greatly feared Achish, king of Gath. David is not demonstrated so far as he fought Goliath. He's killed bears and lions, and he's conquered all kinds of people as a commander. He's a man of war. He's noted as a man of war. But he got down and he chose to go this place because he's on the run now. I'm thinking he left Goliath's sword like back in the woods somewhere and didn't come downtown Gath with Goliath's sword would have. That would be interesting. Who's that guy? That sword looks familiar. So he's recognized and he fears. I didn't do a search, but I don't know how often David was really afraid, because the Spirit of the Lord was upon him because God was using him. Verse 3, so he disguises, verse 13 of 1 Samuel 21, he disguised insanity before them and acted insanely in their hands and scribbled on the doors of the gate and let saliva run down his beard. Then Achish said to his servants, behold, you see the man behaving as a man. Why do you bring him to me? Do I lack madmen that you've brought this one to act the madman in my presence? Shall this one come into my house? Now there was some legend that Achish's wife and daughter all went mad. That's possible that plays into the fact that he's especially not needing another mad person around. For in verse 21, he visits Ahimelech. He receives consecrated bread. He notes that Doeg is there. He receives the sword of Goliath. He flees Achish to the king of Gath. His song is now a regional hit. He's called out by Achish's servants. He's the David. He's the king of the land. He fears, and he acts insane. In 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 1, so David departed from there and escaped to the cave of Adullam. So he's now gone from possibly living, he was living with the king pretty good, eating from his table. Now he's on the run, and now he's living in a cave. Verse 2 of 1 Samuel 22, everyone who was in distress and everyone who was in debt and everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and he became captain over them. There were about 400 men. Prior to that, it also stated that his brothers and his household came to him, which was probably kind of nice. See your mom. Hi, Eliab, how's it going? Those guys. So he's got 400 men. So he's got a new army made up of discontents and general riffraff type people. But they rallied to him. So he attracted even the people that nobody wanted. They rallied to David. Interesting, in verse 5, we don't hear this guy just pops in. Gad is mentioned a few times. In verse 5 it says, the prophet Gad said to David, don't stay in the stronghold, depart and go into the land of Judah. So David departed and went into the forest of Hira. So God puts this Gad guy across his path to give him some direction. He's already gone from Gath, this Philistine town, to a cave, and now he gets a little direction to go back to Judah and live in the forest. And we'll wrap this up with verse 18. Saul is fuming that his own son Jonathan knows what David is out doing. Everybody else knows about what he's doing. They're singing his song, but he doesn't know where he is. And then it bugs him that the priest is kind of betraying Saul. And the priest, so he calls him out, and in verse 18, we'll just skip through it. It says, and Doeg the Edomite turned around and killed the priests. And 85 men who wore the linen ephod. Saul's like whacked out. Okay, he's going to kill the priests. So he's lost touch with God and religion and anything that's going to make his nation better. He struck Nob, the city of the priests, with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, oxen, donkeys, sheep, he struck with the edge of the sword. Now, he didn't just get the priests, he went and he just eliminated them all their kids, all their stuff.
Which was a fulfillment prophecy.
Yes. Verse 20, the son of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled. So there's one guy that got out of there. Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the priests, and David said to Abiathar, I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I've brought about the death of every person in your father's household. Stay with me, don't be afraid. The one who seeks your life is also seeking mine. And in the next chapter, in verse Samuel 23, it's talking about that Abiathar brought the ephod, which was interesting. Because David goes on, we're not going to go into the rest of it. He goes and he inquires of the Lord frequently, should I go here, should I go there? And that was part of the methodology in which God spoke to them, gave him yes, no's kind of answers. So now David has the guilt of this whole priest line and this whole city going down that he's kind of taken on himself. So now, if you want to turn to Psalm 34. So this is all the background, because this psalm was written when David feigned madness before Abimelech, also Achish, who drove him away, and he departed. Verse 1, I will bless the Lord at all times. I will bless the Lord at all times. That's a time, a period, a season, and an appointed time. I will bless the Lord at all times, in every season, at every time, in every period, every appointed moment. I will bless the Lord. He just got away from acting crazy, and his life is kind of unraveling, and he has determined that he will bless the Lord at all times. As the disciples in the prison, right, who sang hymns, there is a time for that. His praise shall continually be in my mouth, continually, regularly, and with continuity. My soul will make its boast in the Lord. He's not a self-made person. He knows he's not a self-made person. His soul is going to boast in the Lord. The humble will hear it and rejoice. Verse 3, O magnify the Lord with me, and let us exalt his name together. This is the blessing of community. This is the blessing of what we have here. This is the blessing of singing together today. That we can magnify the Lord with other people, and we can exalt his name together. He was kind of a loner, but at the same time, he understood the blessing of community. Verse 4, I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. He delivered me from all my fears. He's making us more humbly fearless, which is kind of like meekness. Verse 5, they looked to him and were radiant, and their faces will never be ashamed. The change of countenance, not always circumstance. Our countenance can change, can be bright in a dark spot. Nothing wrong with feeling the hurt, but God can give us a countenance that can be above our circumstances. Verse 6, this poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. Verse 7, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and rescues them. In that sense, we are never alone. We're alone but not alone. And David has a testimony of being literally rescued away from the guys in Gath who knew his name and knew what he was about. And he acted crazy and got out of there. And he wanted to write about it. Verse 8, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. More than hypothetical. We kind of have a hypothetical what God might do in certain situations, right? But he says, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. And that word is used in Proverbs 31:18. Talking about the wife of noble character, she sees that her trading is profitable. She's experienced the fact that she's actually made money on what she's sold. She's been successful. Not she had a plan to be successful. She is successful. And he's using that same word to say, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. I have, he's saying to us. At some point, we want to move from hypothetical Christianity to taste and see, right? That's the challenge of going deeper with God, is when we can move from what things are supposed to be like to what they're really like. That does not mean everything is perfect. And we don't have extremely low points, and we got to deal with stuff. How blessed is the man who takes refuge in him. How blessed is the man who takes refuge. Looking back, we can see how blessed we really are. You might do that in your own life. Look back and say, wow, back then I was thinking this, but I am really blessed. Verse 9, oh, fear the Lord, you saints, for those who fear him there is no want. Fear, reverence for God, the great first step. Verse 10, the young lions do lack and suffer hunger. The powerful lions made common through hunger. The powerful made common, but they who seek the Lord shall not be in want of any good thing. The young lions do lack and suffer hunger, but those who seek the Lord will not be in want of any good thing. Now he's ready to teach others. It makes a little shift here in verse 11. Come, you children, listen to me. I'll teach you the fear of the Lord. Who is the man who desires life and loves length of days that he may see good? You got to follow this simple instruction. It's not long and complicated. You don't have to get a PhD in anything. There's 6 things. Keep your tongue from evil. Well, that's a life work, right? It is for me, keeping your tongue from evil. So that's a challenge. Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Number 2, depart from evil. Number 3, and do good. Number 4, seek peace. Number 5, and pursue it. Number 6, he gave them 6 things because when he's going to teach them the fear of the Lord. Verse 15, the eyes of the Lord are toward the righteous, his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against evildoers, to cut off the memory from the earth. Verse 17, the righteous cry and the Lord hears and delivers them out of all their troubles. He experienced that and will experience it more. And saves those who are crushed in spirit. The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Jesus, God, they understand, right? He understands. People may or may not understand. When you've ever talked about your own personal struggles or trials or the deep, dark moments of your life, some people might give you anecdotes and similar things that happened to them, and you may or may not appreciate that, right? But God is the one person who can identify with your weakest, darkest, deepest, the worst thing that you could imagine. And you had this happen to you, and that happened to you. And when you were young, this happened. And when you were old, that happened. And your wife did this, your husband did that, and your kids did this, and your kids turned out this way or that way. He can understand. People may or may not understand. Because he is the one that's near to the broken heart. He is the one who was familiar with grief. He is the one that came, Jesus himself, to heal the brokenhearted. Verse 19, many of the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers them out of them all. He keeps all his bones, not one of them is broken. Now, this is quoted about Jesus on the cross. It's noted in John 19:36. It's like a quote from this psalm. But, I'm thinking David actually, he got out of there and none of his bones were broken. He was pretty excited about that. Verse 21, evil shall slay the wicked, and those who hate the righteous will be condemned. Romans 12:19 tells us, never take your own revenge. Leave room for God's wrath. God will take care of our enemies. Verse 22, the Lord redeems the soul of his servants, and none of those who take refuge in him will be condemned. Conclusions. Any question about any of that? Comment? I'll give the conclusion, my opinions. This psalm and others accurately reflect a correct response to life's up and downs. This psalm and others accurately reflect a correct response. A lot of people in times of challenge read psalms, right? Because the guy that wrote all of them were made to be sung and plucked, and they were made to be some version of encouragement. First Psalm 52 is about this Doeg guy. Psalm 56 is when the Philistines grab him in Gath. Verse 57 is when he fled from Saul to the cave. And Psalm 142 is like the cave psalm. So if you're like this stuff, there's others to read. The Lord. Here's what the Lord does based on this psalm. He answers. The Lord delivers. The Lord hears. If you ever felt like you've not heard, try taking it up with God, right? Because he hears. Okay? He saves. He rescues. He is good. He is a refuge. His eyes are toward the righteous. His ears are open. He's against evildoers. He's near to the brokenhearted, and he redeems. That's what the psalm testified that he did from a guy who'd been there. Shepherd all the way to the cave. And then he's going to come out of that, and it's got a whole nother, he's got the whole rest of his life to write psalms about. Yeah, he got big trouble, had Uriah killed and all that stuff. Terrible. Read the end of his life. It's like in 1 Chronicles 29 or something like. It's a great testimony of the life of David. In David's dark moment alone captured, he found the Lord met him in every area. God sprinkled David's trial with encouragement. This is what I think is neat about God. I've experienced this personally. Maybe you have. He sprinkled his trials with encouragement. He gets out there the sword of Goliath. That had to be encouraging. Abiathar escaped and came with the effort. That had to be encouraging to him. And his family came to see him. And sometimes when we're feeling alone, it's good to acknowledge the little things that God brings into our life, just, I think, to let you know that he's out there when you don't feel he's out there. Look around. In the darkest times I've had and experiences in my life I've had, there's always been little trails, the little breadcrumbs of God being out there ahead of me, with me, before me, whatever. So you're not alone. You're in a plan. David is a man of action on the outside. He is a man of action. Okay? Warrior, this and that. Up there bringing stuff to his brothers, noticing this giant guy out there ranting against God, etc. He's a man of action. On the outside, he's a great warrior and he's a man's man, but had deeper actions that he shares in the psalm. In the psalm, he goes deep into who he really was, what really made him who he was. He knows the Lord. I sought the Lord, and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears. And he had some fears. Okay, application. I want to encourage myself in the Lord. I think we should encourage ourselves in the Lord. How? These are my opinions. Bless the Lord at all times. Why not? Bless the Lord at all times. I was kind of had a bad day or something. Didn't have anxious cares, was just feeling befuddled a while back. It's like, so I'm reading this. This was last week, a week ago, last Monday. And I get on iTunes music store, whatever they call it, and I don't have zillions of songs. I have some songs I play a lot. They're Christian songs, oldies, that Don Francisco, stuff that I connect with, okay? That's foreign to some people, but that's my thing. So I said, I want some hymns. I want to listen to something to encourage me. So I spent $10.50, right? And bought some guy's album. I don't even know his name. But I trialed a couple of his songs, and they sounded meaningful, and they blessed me. It's like I turned off KFAB that day going to work and listened to that, and that was good. And I've been playing them for my wife, and she likes them. And she sings with them, and that's always encouraging. I can encourage myself in the Lord by blessing the Lord at all times. Psalm 57, when Saul fled to the cave. If you want to turn there with me, I'm just going to read 2 verses of Psalm 57. Psalm 57, (7 and 8 and 9). My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. This is the psalm when he fled, says at the top, when he fled from Saul into the cave. My heart is steadfast, O God, my heart is steadfast. I will sing and make music. Awake, my soul, awake, harp and lyre. I will awaken the dawn. I will praise you, O Lord, among the nations. I will sing of you among the peoples. etc. So this is a way, and you don't have to say, I'm not into singing. Well, it'd be a quiet forest if only those birds sung best. It would be a quiet forest if only those birds sung who sung the best. Hey, many people commute by yourself. Sing on. Find something to sing with. I'm just giving you a personal encouragement. Develop a heart of praise that comes out. Develop a heart of praise that comes out. Praise the Lord when you're here in church. Tell people what God's doing in your life. Share your stuff when there's time to share. Taste and see. Intentionally engage the Lord. Seek Him. Cry out to Him. He listens. Fear God. How? Acknowledge Him for who He is. That's reverencing Him. Acknowledge Him for who He is. He's a righteous rewarder. He's a righteous judge. Regular how? How am I going to fear God? Regular reading of Scripture to figure out who really God is and what He wants me to do. That's how we can fear God. Revere His Word. Acknowledge that He sees me, that He knows me, that before a word is on my tongue in Psalm 139, He knows it completely. Acknowledge Him, that He knows it all. You're not hiding it. I'm not hiding anything from Him. People say, oh, sorry, I said this thing in front of you. Whatever. I'm not your concern. You better be concerned about what God thinks about it. Draw near to God in highs and lows. How? Give God praise in your high points of life. Humbly acknowledge His kindness. Cry out to Him in the low points. High points, low points. We fear God by revering Him and honoring Him in the highs and in the lows. Let's pray. Lord, thanks for the encouragement of the Scriptures that You've put into my life that have encouraged me, and You've been so faithful. Thank You for the times You brought different people, messages, things, circumstances into my life that all I could do was know that they were demonstrations of how You were with me. Thank You for being with us. And I pray for anyone here today who might be discouraged, that You would help them to taste and see that the Lord is good. Help them engage You. Help us to fear You. And just use the words that we shared from Scripture to encourage our hearts, Lord. We're told that things written beforehand were written for our encouragement. Through steadfastness and the encouragement of the Scriptures, we might have hope. Pray You bless Your word to our hearts. In Jesus' name, amen.